Right now, somewhere in your house, there's a book. Maybe it's on an aspirational reading shelf. Maybe it's on a nightstand, half read. You probably don't even think about how it got there. You definitely don't think about the fact that it almost didn't survive at all. Every word you've ever read from the ancient world passed through the hands of a complete stranger. A stranger with ink stained fingers, sitting in a cold stone room, copying a text he didn't always understand from a source that could crumble at any moment. If he had put down his pen and walked away, the words would be gone, not lost like a receipt in a drawer, gone, erased from human memory forever. This almost happened, over and over again. You live in a world where information feels infinite. You assume it'll always be there. But for most of human history, a text existed in exactly one copy, sometimes two, and its survival depended entirely on whether one person in one room decided it was worth the labor of rewriting it by hand. This is the story of the people who made that decision again and again for 1,000 years, and the strange obsessive system they built to make sure knowledge would outlive them. Picture the fall of the Roman Empire, not the dramatic version you've seen in movies. The slow version, trade routes collapsing, cities shrinking, literacy becoming rare. The great libraries of the ancient world were already vulnerable before this decline began. The Library of Alexandria had suffered fires and losses centuries earlier, but the deeper threat wasn't fire, it was neglect. A text doesn't need to be burned to disappear, it only needs to be forgotten. Papyrus rots, parchment cracks, ink fades. Without someone actively recopying a manuscript every generation or two, it simply dissolves back into nothing. Historian Rosamund McKittrick, who spent decades studying manuscript culture in the early medieval period, has documented how narrow this margin of survival really was. Entire genres of classical literature came down to us through a single surviving copy. One copy. If that copy had been lost in a flood, or eaten by insects, or used to relight a fire on a cold night, we wouldn't know it ever existed. So, who decided this mattered enough to save? Monks did. Not because a king ordered them to, not because they were paid well for it, because they usually weren't paid at all. They did it because their entire worldview was built around the idea that words carried weight. Sacred words, yes, but eventually, almost accidentally, all words. Inside monasteries across Europe, a room called the scriptorium became the quiet engine of preservation. Picture rows of monks seated at slanted desks, each copying a manuscript by hand, sometimes for 8 or 10 hours a day. No electric light, no heating in winter cold enough to crack skin. Ink froze in inkwells, fingers cramped, and still they copied. Why would anyone commit their life to this tedious task? Part of the answer's theological. The rule of Saint Benedict, written in the 6th century, structured monastic life around labor and prayer in equal measure, and manuscript copying became one of the most valued forms of labor a monk could offer. But part of the answer is more human than that. Copying a text meant reading it, slowly, word by word, sometimes for months. You can't copy a sentence without understanding its shape. In a strange way, these monks became some of the most careful readers in human history, simply because their job demanded total attention to every letter. Historian David Gans traced how monasteries under Charlemagne's rule in the late 8th and 9th centuries launched a massive campaign of manuscript copying, now referred to as the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne wanted an educated clergy, and an educated clergy needed accurate texts. So, scriptoria, remember those? Scriptoria across the empire began systematically recopying not just scripture, but Roman law, grammar, medicine, and classical literature. This is the moment many surviving texts of ancient Rome were rescued from their final single copy and multiplied into dozens. Here's the part that surprises people. These monks were not simply preserving Christian texts, they were preserving pagan ones too. Cicero, Virgil, Seneca, writers who lived and died centuries before Christianity existed, whose ideas sometimes directly contradicted church teaching. And yet monks copied them anyway. Why save the words of people whose beliefs you don't share? Because somewhere along the way, a shift happened. The monks stopped seeing their job as protecting one religion's words. They started seeing it as protecting the written word itself. Classicist Leighton Reynolds, who studied the transmission of ancient texts through medieval Europe, has shown how many surviving works of Latin literature exist today because of monastic copying chains stretching across centuries, monastery to monastery, each manuscript being recopied before the previous copy decayed too far to read. Think about what that means for a minute. A monk in the ninth century copies a text he may partly disagree with, preserving it not for himself, but for someone he will never meet, 500 years in the future. He'll never know if it worked. He'll never know that you are the one reading it. You are. This system was not glamorous. It was slow, repetitive, and full of small human errors. Scribes misread letters. Words got skipped entirely. Sometimes a tired monk copied the same line twice by accident, and historians can trace these mistakes like fingerprints moving from one manuscript to the next, revealing exactly which copy came from which. In a strange way, the mistakes prove the chain is real. A perfect copy tells you nothing. A flawed one tells you the whole history of how it traveled. And it did travel. Manuscripts moved between monasteries through networks of trade, diplomacy, and religious exchange. A text copied in Ireland might reach a monastery in Germany within a generation. One copied in Italy might end up preserved in England after being nearly lost to fire or war. Every border crossing was another chance for the text to be destroyed and another chance for it to survive. Now, here is the twist most people never learn. The printing press, when it arrived in the 15th century, did not save these texts. It came too late for that. By the time Gutenberg's press began mass producing books in the 1450s, the survival work had already been done. The printing press could only multiply what already existed. If those texts had not survived the previous 1,000 years of hand copying, there would have been nothing left to print. In other words, the printing press gets the credit for spreading knowledge, but it was monks, working in cold rooms with cramping hands, who made sure there was any knowledge left to spread. This changes how you should think about the phrase Dark Ages. That term implies 1,000 years of nothing happening. No light, no thought, no progress. But inside those stone walls, something was happening, constantly. A quiet, unglamorous, absolutely essential act of transmission. Not invention, not genius, just the discipline of Catholic men, consecrated to God, copying, one letter at a time, for someone who had not been born yet. You do this too, in a smaller way, more often than you realize. Every time you save a photo to the cloud before your old phone dies. Every time you back up a file before a hard drive fails. Every time you tell your kids a story your grandma told you because you don't want it to disappear when you do. You are doing exactly what those monks did. You are deciding that something matters enough to carry forward, even if you never see who receives it. The difference is scale and the stakes. They were not saving one photo. They were saving the entire intellectual inheritance of the ancient world, one fragile page at a time, against fire, war, rot, and time itself. So the next time you pick up a book, any book, think about the chain behind it. Somewhere back along that chain is a monk you will never know about, in a monastery that no longer exists, copying words he might not have agreed with, for a reader he could not imagine. That reader was never a stranger to him. It was always going to be you,